Let's start with what actually happened. On October 28, 2025, Cameco Corporation and Brookfield Asset Management announced they had entered into a binding term sheet with the United States Department of Commerce to establish a strategic partnership expected to accelerate the global deployment of Westinghouse Electric Company's nuclear reactor technologies and reinvigorate supply chains and the nuclear power industrial base in the U.S. and abroad. The agreement provides for the U.S. government to arrange financing and facilitate the permitting and approvals for new Westinghouse nuclear reactors to be built in the U.S., with an aggregate investment value of at least $80 billion, including near-term financing of long lead time items. That's the headline. $80 billion. New American nuclear reactors, American energy sovereignty, American jobs. But strip away the press release language and look at who is actually sitting at this table. Brookfield and Cameco formed a strategic partnership to acquire Westinghouse in October 2022. These are Canadian companies. Brookfield's parent is based in Toronto. Cameco is based in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Cameco is one of the largest global providers of the uranium fuel needed to power a secure energy future, with its competitive position based on its controlling ownership of the world's largest high-grade reserves and low-cost operations, as well as significant investments across the nuclear fuel cycle, including ownership interests in Westinghouse Electric Company and Global Laser Enrichment. So the technology that is supposed to rebuild American energy sovereignty is co-owned by a Canadian miner and a Canadian investment giant. The uranium that is going to fuel those reactors comes from Canadian mines in Saskatchewan, and the Prime Minister of Canada, until very recently, was a senior executive at Brookfield. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a corporate org chart. And it has enormous geopolitical implications that are only now being fully appreciated. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick said the $80 billion pact with Westinghouse embodies the bold vision of President Trump to rebuild our energy sovereignty, create high-paying jobs, and drive America to the forefront of the nuclear renaissance. Bold words. But energy sovereignty built on Canadian uranium, Canadian ownership, and Canadian supply chains is a particular kind of sovereignty. It is interdependent sovereignty. And in the current environment, where Trump has slapped sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, that interdependence is becoming the most important card in Ottawa's hand. Before we can understand the political leverage Canada holds, we need to understand the geology, because it is extraordinary and it is the foundation of everything. The United States holds an estimated 59,400 tons of uranium, accounting for just 1% of the global supply, whereas Canada possesses 580,500 tons. Additionally, Canada boasts the world's largest deposits of high-grade uranium, with concentrations reaching up to 20% uranium, 100 times higher than the global average. 100 times the global average concentration. That is not a marginal advantage. That is a generational, geological monopoly on high-quality nuclear fuel. Canada holds the highest-grade uranium deposits globally, some 100 times the world average, a source of major strategic advantage. Overwhelmingly based in Saskatchewan, with some small legacy locations in Ontario, the uranium industry is dominated by the Prairie Province. Saskatchewan boasts the 4 major Canadian uranium mine sites at McArthur River, Cigar Lake, McLean Lake, and Rabbit Lake, all within the Athabasca Basin. According to the World Nuclear Association, Canada produces about 24% of the world's uranium, making it the second largest producer behind Kazakhstan. The United States is number 12. Number 12. America is the world's largest consumer of nuclear power, and it ranks 12th in the world in terms of uranium production. That is the structural vulnerability at the heart of the Trump nuclear plan, and that is why Canada's position is so powerful. You cannot build $80 billion worth of American nuclear reactors without a reliable supply of fuel, and that supply does not exist in meaningful quantities inside America's own borders. Uranium supply is heavily dominated by Russia and China, which together control over 50% of the world's uranium enrichment capacity. This concentration poses significant risks to U.S. energy stability and national security. So the choice for the United States in uranium is essentially Canada, Russia, or China. When you frame it that way, Canada's leverage becomes self-evident. You do not pick a fight with your most critical energy supplier unless you are prepared to run toward Moscow or Beijing for your fuel. And in the current geopolitical climate, that is not a politically viable option for any American administration. Now we need to talk about the man himself. Mark Carney did not arrive in politics as a blank slate. He arrived as one of the most connected financial figures in the Western world, with deep institutional knowledge of exactly the sector that now sits at the center of the most important energy geopolitical story on the continent. Brookfield is Carney's baby. He was the chairman before becoming Prime Minister of Canada, but still has his financial fortune in Brookfield. That is not a minor biographical detail. That is the single most important piece of context for understanding how Carney approaches this entire nuclear and energy relationship with the United States. He knows Westinghouse. He knows the AP1000 reactor economics. He knows how uranium supply chains work. He knows what it means when the U.S. government commits $80 billion to a nuclear build-out that runs through Canadian mines and Canadian corporate ownership. Brookfield Renewable, a listed affiliate of Brookfield Asset Management, where Prime Minister Mark Carney was a board member before entering politics, gained around 5% when the deal was announced. So when the Trump administration announced its nuclear partnership with Westinghouse, the company that Carney's former firm co-owns went up nearly a quarter in a single day, and Brookfield Renewable climbed. The Prime Minister of Canada's financial legacy is directly intertwined with the success of the very nuclear program that the United States says is about American energy independence. This is not a conflict of interest in the conventional sense. Carney has made the appropriate disclosures. But it is something arguably more interesting. It is an alignment of interests. When America's nuclear plan succeeds, Canadian assets win. When Canadian uranium flows into American reactors, Canadian mines and Canadian companies profit. And that alignment means Carney has every personal, professional, and political reason to ensure that the Canada-US nuclear relationship functions smoothly, while simultaneously having every reason to ensure that Canada extracts the maximum possible value from the indispensability of its position. The U.S. government sees the Canadian-owned Westinghouse Nuclear Company as a tool of American influence. Federal officials have warned Natural Resources Minister Tim Hodgson. The U.S. government continues to actively promote the adoption of Westinghouse technology abroad, including in Canada, and considers Westinghouse a key U.S. strategic asset regardless of its ownership structure, said a briefing note prepared for Hodgson last summer. That briefing note is extraordinary in its candor. The Americans are essentially saying, we don't care that Canadians own this company. We consider it ours strategically, and that assertion directly contradicts Canadian sovereignty over what is nominally a Canadian corporate asset. It is a tension that has not been resolved, and it is precisely the kind of tension that Carney, with his financial and policy background, is uniquely positioned to navigate and exploit. You cannot understand the uranium leverage story without understanding the broader tariff context in which it is playing out, because Carney is not operating in a vacuum. He came to power during one of the most disruptive periods in the Canada-US trade relationship since NAFTA was negotiated. Ever since Donald Trump slapped tariffs on Canadian goods on February 1, 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney has been encouraging trade with nations other than the United States. That is the public posture, diversification, looking east to India, looking to Europe, building alternative markets. But the private strategic calculation is more nuanced, because even as Carney pursues diversification, the most powerful leverage he holds is not the threat of sending Canadian uranium to India. It is the implicit threat of not sending it to the United States at the moment the United States needs it most. Negotiations with the Trump administration are delicate, and the Carney government needs all the bargaining power it can get to achieve a fair deal for Canadians. Industries such as auto, steel, and lumber are contentious enough to be top of Donald Trump's mind when he contemplates turning the well-established Canada-US supply chain upside down. Canada, however, is overlooking resources that give it an advantage. In the past, Canada leveraged its vast uranium deposits to negotiate from a position of strength, and it can do so again. The U.S. lacks sufficient proven uranium deposits itself and instead relies on Canada, among other states, to fuel demand from its nuclear power generation. A 25% tariff on Canadian mineral imports could cost U.S. off-takers an additional $11.75 billion, a figure that would increase as base metal and uranium prices recover. Think about what that means in the context of an $80 billion nuclear build-out. You cannot build those reactors, you cannot fuel those reactors, and you cannot operate those reactors without Canadian uranium flowing reliably into the American supply chain. Tariffs on Canadian minerals are not just a trade irritant. They are potentially a self-inflicted wound in the most strategically sensitive energy program the Trump administration has announced. Speaking at the 2025 Toronto Global Forum, Ontario Premier Doug Ford said the U.S. needs Canada as a partner in order to meet growing energy demand, particularly from the data centers needed to fuel rapid adoption of artificial intelligence. They're in desperate need of our energy, Ford said. Uranium gets shipped from Saskatchewan over to Port Hope in Ontario, gets refined here, and then gets enriched down in the U.S. They have 94 turbines that rely on Canadian uranium. 94 American nuclear turbines rely on Canadian uranium. This is the leverage that exists right now before a single new AP1000 reactor has been built under the $80 billion plan. The existing American nuclear fleet is already deeply dependent on Canadian supply. Multiply that by the scale of the new build program, and you begin to understand why the word leverage is not hyperbole. It is a precise and accurate description of Canada's position. The corporate story inside all of this geopolitics is Cameco, and it is a remarkable one. Cameco Corp's stock jumped almost $28 on Tuesday to close about $149 and is still around $148 the following morning when the $80 billion deal was announced. A 23% single-day move on news that an American government program would accelerate demand for a Canadian company's uranium. The markets understood immediately what many commentators took weeks to appreciate. Cameco and Westinghouse are seeing significant interest in the proven AP1000 reactor technology. It's the modern reactor that stands out as the most deployed Generation 3+ technology in operation today, with advanced passive safety features, standardized and repeatable design, construction-ready certainty, and proven world-class operating performance. As a strategic partner, Cameco is a secure and reliable Western-based supplier of the uranium fuel needed to support the civilian deployment and long-term reliable operation of Westinghouse's technology in the U.S. and globally. That is how Cameco describes itself in the formal partnership announcement, a Western-based supplier. The implicit contrast is obvious: not Russian, not Chinese, Western. And in the current security environment, that distinction carries a premium that cannot be fully quantified, but is absolutely real. As Westinghouse's co-owner and a major uranium and fuel cycle supplier, Cameco expects the partnership to add significant long-term value, positioning Canadian uranium and conversion services as reliable Western-aligned inputs to a large U.S. reactor program that supports jobs and investment in Saskatchewan and Ontario, given the location of uranium mines created by Cameco. The supply chain story for Saskatchewan in particular is transformative. If numerous large reactors are built in the United States, the opportunity notably improves uranium production prospects for Saskatchewan's mining sector. The province that sits on the world's richest uranium deposits is looking at a generational demand surge driven by an American infrastructure program. This is not a marginal benefit. This is an economic supercycle for a Canadian province that has been waiting for exactly this moment. Now let's talk about what Carney did next, because it is analytically brilliant, and it is almost certainly not a coincidence. Cameco has entered a long-term agreement to supply uranium ore concentrate to the government of India's Department of Atomic Energy for use in the country's fleet of nuclear reactors. The agreement will see Cameco supply nearly 22 million pounds of uranium ore concentrate to India over a 9-year period on market-related price terms, with a total contract value estimated at approximately $2.6 billion. Deliveries under the contract are expected to begin in 2027 and run through 2035. Cameco's CEO Tim Gitzel attended an event in Delhi today to celebrate the agreement alongside Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, and Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe. The Prime Minister of Canada personally traveled to India to stand on stage at the signing of a uranium supply deal. That is not standard protocol for a commercial contract. That is a geopolitical signal. It says Canada has other customers, credible, large-scale customers with ambitious nuclear programs. America is not the only game in town for Canadian uranium. In line with the Carney government's goal for economic diversification, the uranium supply also offers Canada the ability to build stronger relationships with non-G7 responsible buyers in Latin America, like Brazil and Argentina. Perhaps by leveraging its uranium advantage, the Carney government can demonstrate to the Americans the advantages of Canada-US trade, while also continuing to be a global leader in the promotion of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. This is the core of Carney's strategic posture. It is not confrontation, it is optionality. By demonstrating that Canadian uranium can flow to India and can flow to other markets, Carney is establishing that any American assumption of a captive Canadian supplier is mistaken. Canada is a willing partner. But it is a partner with choices, and partners with choices negotiate from a fundamentally different position than suppliers with no alternatives. The global nuclear energy industry is expected to grow by up to $200 billion per year by 2030. In that environment, the idea that Canadian uranium can only be sold to one customer, even a very large and familiar one, is economically absurd. The world is going nuclear, and the world needs fuel. Canada has the fuel. The question Carney is quietly but persistently answering is, on what terms? Here is where the story gets considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting from a strategic standpoint, because Canadian uranium does not go directly from Saskatchewan mines into American reactors. It goes through a process called enrichment, increasing the concentration of the fissile U-235 isotope, and that enrichment process creates a vulnerability that cuts both ways. Even as U.S. President Donald Trump talks of waging a campaign of economic force to persuade Canada to join a political union with the United States, Ontario Power Generation is preparing to construct an American reactor at its Darlington nuclear generating station. The reactor's uranium fuel would be enriched at a facility in New Mexico, a new vulnerability U.S. administrations could exploit. So Canada mines the uranium. America enriches some of it. And if relations deteriorate sufficiently, America could theoretically withhold enrichment services from Canada, disrupting Canada's own nuclear expansion. But the counter-leverage is equally stark. If the U.S. decided to pull enrichment capacity, it would be Russia, then it's China, and then there's some in France, Netherlands, UK, and Germany. That's it. The enrichment market is extraordinarily concentrated, and within that concentrated market, Russian enrichment capacity has been increasingly sanctioned and restricted in the post-Ukraine environment. Uranium supply is currently heavily dominated by Russia and China, which together control over 50% of the world's uranium enrichment capacity. So the U.S. would be ill-advised to use enrichment as a weapon against Canada, because the alternatives are precisely the adversaries that American nuclear energy policy is designed to reduce dependence on. There is no clean move for Washington in this chess match. Every aggressive play against Canadian nuclear supply creates a dependency risk elsewhere. Canada has never had much appetite for enriched uranium, but that could soon change. Ontario Power Generation is in the early stages of building 4 reactors at its Darlington station that require enriched fuel, and there are tentative plans to build more in other provinces. Relying on foreign suppliers for enriched uranium, particularly Russian or American ones, seems increasingly risky. A growing chorus argues it's time for Canada to consider enriching uranium itself. If Canada moves into uranium enrichment, and the conversation is now explicitly happening at the federal level, it transforms from a raw material supplier into a full-cycle nuclear power. The leverage that Canada currently holds at the mining end of the chain would extend all the way through to the enriched fuel that goes into reactors. That is a qualitative shift in Canada's position in the global nuclear economy, and it is not an abstract possibility. It is being actively studied. There is a deeper question underneath all of this commercial and geopolitical maneuvering, and it is one that Canada has been somewhat slow to confront directly. As Canada expands its own nuclear fleet, does it build Canadian reactors or American ones? Does it double down on the homegrown CANDU technology, or does it align with the Westinghouse AP1000 that is at the center of the Trump plan? Canada's uranium is a strategic asset, but recent industry choices suggest growing dependence on U.S. technology, enrichment, and markets, potentially limiting Ottawa's control and future industrial benefits. SMRs require enriched uranium that Canada cannot supply, and the Cameco deal positions Westinghouse reactors under U.S. systems, raising questions about whether Canada is becoming a passive supplier rather than a nuclear leader, or, as Prime Minister Mark Carney puts it, an energy superpower. That is an uncomfortable question, and it points to a genuine tension at the heart of Canadian nuclear strategy. Experts told the Globe and Mail that there's no aspect of the CANDU's fuel cycle that relies on American inputs, making it more resilient to disruption. The CANDU reactor runs on unenriched uranium, natural uranium mined in Saskatchewan, milled, converted, and loaded directly into the reactor without ever passing through an American or Russian enrichment facility. From a pure sovereignty standpoint, CANDU is the most resilient choice Canada can make for its own domestic energy security. Whereas CANDU reactors are Canadian to the core, the briefing note said, many aspects of the CANDU system were historically based on principles of Canadian energy independence, particularly from the U.S. Indeed, the federal government owns the CANDU intellectual property, and AtkinsRéalis licenses it exclusively. So Canada owns the intellectual property on a proven reactor design that runs on unenriched uranium and requires no American input at any stage of the fuel cycle. And yet the country is simultaneously embracing U.S.-designed SMRs and participating in a partnership built around Westinghouse's technology. The tension is real, and it is not yet resolved. While all of this geopolitical maneuvering is happening, Canada is simultaneously undertaking the largest domestic nuclear expansion in 3 decades. The Ontario government approved 4 GE Hitachi BWRX 300 SMRs at Ontario Power Generation's Darlington site in May at an estimated cost of $20.9 billion, marking Canada's first nuclear expansion in over 30 years. The first unit is scheduled for completion by the end of 2030, positioning it as North America's first commercial SMR. On September 11, 2025, Prime Minister Carney referred the Darlington New Nuclear Project to the Major Projects Office. That is the designation that unlocks accelerated federal coordination for major infrastructure. Carney is not merely talking about nuclear power as a geopolitical card. He is building nuclear capacity domestically at a speed and scale that Canada has not seen since the 1970s. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a $2 billion investment in the Darlington nuclear project in Ontario amid massive economic uncertainty. $2 billion of federal money into a single nuclear project at a moment of maximum trade tension with the United States. That is a statement of strategic intent. It says Canada is not going to be merely a uranium exporter to other countries' nuclear programs. It is building its own baseload nuclear capacity and positioning itself as a full-spectrum nuclear power. The strategy will build on decades of made-in-Canada innovation, including in CANDU technology, abundant uranium resources, a first-class workforce, and a world-leading safety regime. It will focus on growing Canadian industry in order to achieve energy affordability and security at home while seizing the global opportunity of a global industry expected to grow by up to $200 billion per year by 2030. The government's formal nuclear strategy describes an ambition that goes far beyond simply selling uranium to foreign buyers. Canada wants to be a nuclear superpower in every dimension: mining, conversion, reactor construction, technology development, and eventually enrichment. If that ambition is realized, Canada's position in the global nuclear economy becomes not just significant, but structurally indispensable. Let us now return to what may be the most analytically interesting wrinkle in this entire story. The U.S. government considers Westinghouse a key U.S. strategic asset regardless of its ownership structure. That is an extraordinary claim. The company is co-owned by Brookfield and Cameco, both Canadian entities, and yet the American government has internally declared it a U.S. strategic asset. What does that mean in practice? It means that Washington is asserting a kind of extraterritorial claim over an asset that does not formally belong to it. And it means that the $80 billion partnership, which formally grants the U.S. government a participation interest in Westinghouse's future cash flows, is partly a mechanism for bringing that claim into legal reality. Under the new strategic partnership, the U.S. government will receive a participation interest which, once vested, entitles it to 20% of any cash distributions above $17.5 billion from Westinghouse. Think about what that means. The U.S. government is acquiring a financial stake in a company it considers its own strategic asset, a company it did not actually own before, in exchange for the financing and regulatory support it is promising to provide. The Canadians get accelerated reactor deployment and demand for their uranium. The Americans get partial ownership of the technology company and the geopolitical prestige of saying they are building nuclear reactors. Canada's uranium is a strategic asset, but recent industry choices suggest growing dependence on U.S. technology, enrichment, and markets, potentially limiting Ottawa's control and future industrial benefits. This is the analytical knife edge on which Canadian nuclear policy currently sits. The partnership creates enormous economic opportunity. $80 billion of American reactor construction is a bonanza for Cameco, for Saskatchewan, for the entire Canadian nuclear supply chain. But it also potentially deepens the structural dependency on American technology and enrichment that represents a long-term vulnerability. Carney understands this tension more acutely than almost anyone. He has sat at Brookfield's boardroom table. He has read the financial models on Westinghouse's AP 1000 economics. He knows that the partnership is simultaneously Canada's greatest commercial opportunity in the nuclear sector and a potential trap that could reduce Canada from an energy superpower to an energy supplier in a chain controlled from Washington. Navigating that paradox is his central challenge in nuclear policy. And based on the decisions made so far, the India deal, the domestic nuclear expansion, the internal debate on enrichment, it appears he is navigating it with considerably more sophistication than the public conversation around tariffs and bluster would suggest. Here is what we know with certainty. The United States has committed to building at least $80 billion worth of new nuclear reactors using technology co-owned by Canadian companies, fueled by Canadian uranium, in a supply chain that runs through Canadian provinces. The success of Trump's most ambitious energy infrastructure program is dependent on Canadian cooperation. And the Prime Minister of Canada is a former chairman of one of the two companies that co-own the reactor technology at the center of that program. The uranium industry contributed approximately $2.6 billion to Canada's economy in 2024, while directly employing over 3,400 Canadians, nearly half of whom are workers and residents in Saskatchewan's north. That is what the industry looks like today before a single AP 1000 reactor is built in the United States. Scale that by the demand implications of an $80 billion American nuclear build-out, and the numbers become transformative for Canadian communities that have been fighting for economic development for decades. The uranium comes from Canada. The technology company is partly Canadian. The Prime Minister of Canada ran the investment firm that co-owns the reactor company. And in the middle of a tariff war, Canada quietly signed a $2.6 billion uranium supply deal with India to demonstrate to anyone paying attention that there are other customers.